Welcome to Calvary Conversations. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Philip Dow for part 2 of an interview on the topic of intellectual virtues. Philip Dow has been the head of Roslyn Academy for 17 years, but he is also the author of a book called Virtuous Minds that he produced to help give some language to the concept of intellectual virtues and the research that he had been doing, and that on the topic of, I would say, what it means to form good intellectual habits and how to put language to that. Is that a good summary there of your book, Phil?
Yeah, that is.
Well, and speaking of summary, we want to go right in. We want to dive right into the concept of intellectual virtues. I do encourage anyone listening to please go back and watch that first interview where we really fleshed this out a little bit more. But briefly, again, Phil, just outline for us, if you could, kind of maybe not quite your elevator pitch, but close to that, of what intellectual virtues are, why they're important, and maybe detail the intellectual virtues that you listed in your book, Virtuous Minds.
Yeah, sure. So I think one thing that's really helpful is to think about intellectual virtue as being the good version of intellectual character. So intellectual character is something that we all have, and that is we all have habits of thinking, habits of mind that form the lens through which we do all of our thinking, all of our decision making, all of our critical thinking. So we all have intellectual character. Some of us have habits that are negative. Some of us have habits that are positive. And intellectual virtue is the aim or the pursuit of intellectual character or thinking habits of mind that are virtuous, that are positive, that are in the pursuit of truth. And it yields not just truth, but all kinds of other positives in our lives, whether it's through healthy relationships or success in your field or whatever it may be. These intellectual virtues are a foundation for a flourishing life. And as for Christians in particular, the intellectual virtues are a wonderful explanation of what it means to love God with your mind. It is, we talk about moral virtue as Christians. These are things that we want to aspire to, and these are Christ-like attributes. The same thing applies for intellectual virtues. And I'll give you a few examples. So the 7 that we talk about at Roslyn in terms of virtues, and other people have 9 or up to 13 sometimes, but 7 that we've chosen at Roslyn are intellectual humility, intellectual honesty, intellectual fair-mindedness, intellectual curiosity, carefulness, courage, and I've forgotten one. How embarrassing is that? I think I've given you 6, but anyways.
Right? Did you say
sorry?
Tenacity?
I did say tenacity. Thank you. Yes, intellectual tenacity is the 7th that we've chosen. And if you take each one of these, and I can't obviously go into all 7 of them, but let's take intellectual tenacity as an example. It is self-explanatory. It is the habit of mind that someone has who wants truth so much that they're willing to push through challenges or obstacles in the pursuit of truth. And so intellectual tenacity is something that we develop over time, and hopefully from a young age, and we build so that by the time someone is an adult, let's say they're a researcher or whatever they're doing in their career, they have this built-in habit of pushing through in their pursuit of truth, and it yields all kinds of fruits in their life, relationally, vocationally, holistically.
Right. Now, the intellectual virtues also aren't, what fascinates me constantly about them when I teach them and when I reflect on them in my own practice, is they aren't really siloed into separate skills, are they? They really have a lot of overlap. If you could kind of explain some of that too, that might be helpful.
Yeah, no, that's really true. What you find is when you start practicing or giving attention to one of the virtues, almost always other virtues come along as part of the package because they affect each other. So if you're an intellectually curious person, for instance, that curiosity is only going to be as powerful as your intellectual tenacity. So if you think about all these different virtues, how they encourage each other in the virtuous sense, and how they can also be negatives. If you have, instead of, let's say, intellectual fair-mindedness, you're an intellectually biased person, where we all are biased to some extent. But the vices can also act as kind of a negative drag on your intellectual character. One thing I'd say on that too is, if you were to sum up intellectual virtue in one kind of idea, it is the character traits or the habits of mind that come from a pursuit of truth. So intellectual virtue, all these virtues are just the natural byproducts of a pursuit of truth. And the more you do that, the more you build. It's like working out, working your muscles. The more you strengthen your muscles, the more you're going to see the benefits throughout your life in terms of health and everything else.
So when you think of, I want to transition, because the majority of the interview that we do today, I really want to focus on how you've taken these intellectual virtues and integrated them into your curriculum at Roslyn. And if you could describe, there has to be something like philosophical here. I mean, there's a basic philosophical difference when you approach an education curriculum saying, we want students to develop these virtues, as opposed to just learning certain information, right? Can you kind of summarize or give an overview of why it's so important, and maybe how you would define the integration of intellectual virtues into an educational curriculum?
Yeah. So let me kind of interpret your question. And what I hear you saying is, how is a virtue-based curriculum or educational program different from maybe a non-virtue-based or a traditional or a typical classroom setting? Is that?
Let's do that. Yeah, let's take that.
Okay.
Let's take that. Mm-hmm.
So if we frame the question that way, I would say that what we find, and maybe you're right. I think that wasn't exactly what you're asking, but let me go with this, and we'll see where this leads. But what we find at Roslyn is, and any good education is going to have the pursuit of truth as part of it in some way. Okay, and to that extent, any education is going to have the seeds for developing intellectual virtue. Okay, so that theoretically that's the case. So if you find a great classroom doing some unusual curriculum and unusual philosophy, but the pursuit of truth is part of that, you're going to have the virtues being included in that, even though they aren't described or named or there's any attention brought to them, but they will inevitably be part of it. Okay. Having said that, most education today, as I was preparing for this discussion, I went back and looked at some university mottos to go back and say, okay, when we talk about education, what does education mean? What did it mean in the 1600s and 1700s? And you go back, Harvard's motto is veritas, which is truth. Yale's motto is truth and light, or light and truth. Okay. And one thing I found is really interesting, and I don't know if it's even here in front of me, but University of West Virginia, of all places, their motto, if I can find it, because it's just excellent, it is add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge. Okay, that's the University of West Virginia. Wow. I mean, that is scripture, right there for us, and it talks about the pursuit of truth or knowledge, okay, being the thing that is the aspiration of education. Now, to the extent that education is that way, the virtues are a natural fit. But education today oftentimes has goals that are not, they're not anti-truth, although that could be argued in some cases too. But their goals are tangential to truth. it's developing skills for the marketplace, or developing a kind of a worldview that promotes activism or justice, let's say. So education can have a whole bunch of different goals. It can be to get a good education so you can get wealthy, or to get a good job, or to be powerful, or to be influential, or whatever it may be. To the extent that those are the goals of education, either stated goals or implied goals, that intellectual virtue will be lost, because virtues come with the pursuit of truth. And when there's another pursuit that's primary, then if, in other words, if knowledge is not if truth is not the end, if there's other ends, then the means will also be corrupted by whatever the end is. So if the goal is power, then you're going to do whatever it takes to get to power. If the goal is skills, then you're going to pursue skills. And truth may or may not come along for the ride. Where if the purpose of education is, as Christians, loving God with our minds and the pursuit of God's truth, then that is naturally going to be bringing along the virtues. It will be less successful if we don't name them and be self-conscious about developing them, but it'll still be, you're starting off with a healthier foundation for education. So yeah, go ahead.
So would you say that the current, and I wouldn't necessarily say traditional education systems, let's say our current education systems in the U.S., do you think that they are well set up to develop intellectual character, or do you see them as largely problematic in some of the ways that you just described?
Yeah, I would say that I'm not a doomsdayer, in the sense that all current education is a waste of time, or putting kids down the wrong path. I would say there's significant flaws in our current educational culture and curriculum and mission. But what I'd say is, if I go to any good classroom, any good teacher who is really trying to inspire thinking, and I think about, for instance, the IB program. There's a lot of strengths with the International Baccalaureate program. They have a learner profile, and if you look at the learner profile, there are a lot of the virtues that we aspire to as well. And it's because what they're trying to do is, the catchphrase for a generation at least has been lifelong learners. Okay, that's a noble aim. Now, what does it mean to be a lifelong learner? Well, you have a whole variety of definitions for that, and sometimes it can be a pretty empty cliche, because really the pursuit is these skills, or this set of content that will get them to the next level. It's not necessarily about learning and growing. So intellectual virtue is much more concerned with how we learn and who we become as learners than it is about content. Now, having said that, content is very, very important, obviously, because truth is made up of content, and content, so it's not like it's some of the progressive educators are, well, let's not worry about content, let's worry about, these skills or whatnot. Intellectual virtue is saying, no, content is part of the truth that we're pursuing, and it's a good thing. So to sum up, what I'm trying to say is, wherever good learning, or wherever there is a teacher that is pursuing truth and encouraging their kids to wrestle and to struggle towards the pursuit of truth, there is going to be education happening that is deeply aligned with the pursuit of intellectual virtue. So that can and should happen even in the secular learning environment. In fact, there's a lot of secular schools that are picking up on this idea. It's a little less rich because it's divorced from what I think is the ultimate meaning and foundation for these virtues, and that is loving God with our minds and honoring our Creator through the pursuit of His truth. But there still is, there's general revelation, I think, as I mentioned last time, and we see that whenever there's good learning happening in any environment.
Right. I love what you're saying there, because we don't throw out content in favor of intellectual virtues. Or intellectual character. The studying of content, though, sits within that. Yes. And I think we have to challenge ourselves too. I think every educator has an overarching philosophy, whether it be social justice or social betterment, or just covering material. This is what it means to know, to have knowledge in this field or whatever, right? That will be the lens through which they view their classroom and through which all their teaching is constructed and conducted. And that to me was I don't know, a great revelation of this book was, what if I developed my learning around intellectual virtues, around character, and my teaching sat within that, as opposed to those sort of being incidental or accidental almost outcomes of my teaching. Let's talk specifically about how you have integrated this into a high school environment. Tell us about the structure. And boy, I can imagine when you first began this, did it just fundamentally change your normal framework of education, or does it work well with approaches that are tried and true?
Yeah. So, what we've actually done, we actually, because we're a K through 12 school, so our thinking was character development can happen throughout our life. You can be 75 years old, 85 years old, and still be developing your character. But the older you get, the more your kind of ruts of habit are ingrained, and the harder it is to vary out of those. But it is possible. And certainly as Christians, we believe that God can do amazing things in our life through the power of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
But we also recognize that when those habits are being developed at a young age, that's where we want to get in and start to encourage these virtues like intellectual tenacity and intellectual fair-mindedness, intellectual courage, And so we've actually spent a lot of time investing in our elementary school and the integration of intellectual virtue in the elementary school. And now we're K through 12. But I think if you were to come to Roslyn, you'd say, wow, there's a lot in the elementary school and a lot going on in high school, but it's built on the earlier stages. So your question is, how has it changed the way we do education, or the structure, or does it look different from what we looked like before we started this? And I'd say there are in some ways there are clear differences, and I think definitely for the better. And in some cases, a good classroom looks very similar to what it did before we introduced intellectual virtue, in that they were already pursuing truth, and the teacher was already challenging kids, even though they didn't call it intellectual virtue. They were already encouraging kids to ask good questions and to be courageous enough to raise their hand and to listen fairly to their fellow students. So anywhere that good teaching is happening, you're going to see this. Now, what's been different for us and has been extremely powerful, I think, is the use of the language of intellectual virtue. Because like I said, good teaching is doing intellectual virtue probably in some way. But what happens when you put a name to it is it gives students hooks upon which to hang their experiences of pursuing these virtues. They suddenly start seeing virtue where they didn't see it before, and they see it and can call it out in their peers. They can see it modeled, and they start to value it. They see, oh yeah, I see this student. Joe is a really fair-minded student. Joe listens fairly, and so as a result, the class discussions are so much more rich because Joe is really listening and he's asking good questions, okay? And it changes the classroom environment. I want to be like Joe. And I know what Joe is doing because the teacher has pointed out that Joe is intellectually fair-minded. Joe, I really appreciated the fact that you're listening well to your students, and you're trying to take an argument that you disagree with strongly and give it the benefit of the doubt, so that you can see where their argument is. That's one fundamental shift. And just simply using the language of intellectual virtue has brought a richness to what was already a good classroom environment. And it's also raised the bar for classrooms who maybe weren't asking good questions or weren't pursuing the virtues. They were more just skill or fact-based classes. where we talk about these virtues, there's a recognition that, you know what, these virtues, to do this, a classroom environment that is pursuing intellectual virtue or pursuing truth requires depth as opposed to breadth. And so there's a willingness or an acceptability to say, okay, we're gonna take a little bit longer and we're gonna dig deeper, because I want my students to wrestle with this. I want them to ask questions that maybe they wouldn't have asked if we're just rushing through to get the content. And it's challenged teachers to rethink what is important in the lesson. Is it worth going spending a little bit longer on this to allow students to stretch their intellectual virtue muscles? So depth over breadth has been one result. But the fundamental shift is obviously what is the goal? Is the goal that our students at the end of their time at Roslyn, that they have a set body of information that they take with them? Or is the goal to produce a certain type of person, a certain type of thinker? That, you know, it's the classic, you know, cliche, but it's an important one. You know, you give a person a fish and however they can eat for a day or whatever, teach them how to fish and they'll, you know, be fed for a lifetime or whatever, however it goes. Well, intellectual virtue applied to education is the same way. If our goal is to say at the end of their high school, they know, you know, they've taken chemistry and biology and they'll forget that, by the way, in 10 minutes after they graduate. Or now they won't forget it all. That's, you know, I don't want to be cynical, but they'll forget a lot of the content. But hopefully what they won't forget is and what will change them forever is these habits that they've developed in the pursuit of truth in your school, that they will take and apply to everything else that they do, whether it's having conversations with their spouse or whether it's in their workplace, wherever it is. Those habits of thinking can be life transforming. There's a writer, a secular writer named Ron Richard, who's done a lot of writing with Making Thinking Visible. That's one of his well-known books. And he has a great quote in a book that he wrote called Intellectual Character, which is 2002. And he's from Harvard's Project Zero, and he basically says, you know, what's the goal of education? Is it that they'll learn all this stuff? And he says, no, they'll probably forget it. But at the end, what will stick with them are habits of thinking, habits of mind. And really, he's talking about the virtues from a secular perspective, but again, from a perspective that we can affirm strongly.
So you do go into a bit of the integration of intellectual virtues in your book, Virtuous Minds. There's at least one chapter I remember at the end that deals with that. I would love to see and this is just a suggestion for the future, a book that addresses curriculum design from that standpoint. I was radically changed by the book Understanding by Design by Grant Wiggins and McTighe are the two authors that put that out, because it really addresses coverage as one of the sins of education, right? We cover material and we do a lot of activity, the twin sins of education, which are not bad, but if they're devoid of being connected to an underlying pursuit of understanding, they're just sort of they're not as impactful in the long term. I would love to see intellectual character meshed in with that or part of that discussion. So this is just a suggestion to you.
Yeah, no, it's a great suggestion. So let me kind of highlight a couple things. I'm really glad you brought this up. So Jason Bear, who is really kind of, I would say, the world's leading voice on intellectual virtue development or intellectual character development. He's a professor at Loyola Marymount and actually a good friend of mine. And also an evangelical Christian. In fact, that's kind of part of what he's a philosopher, and this is what got him into intellectual virtue. He's just written a book, should be coming out shortly, that is a very practical look at implementing or integrating intellectual virtue into a school. It goes into much more detail than mine is. Mine is meant to kind of explain what the concept of intellectual character and intellectual virtue is and show how important it is for our lives. And he's then now taken the work of Intellectual Virtues Academy in Los Angeles, and his own research and his own writing, and has produced a book. I think it's in Routledge Press, or I don't remember which press it is. Anyways, it's coming out soon. So if you look for Jason Baehr, Baehr, he should have a book coming out very soon that will do a good job on how to do this well. But you mentioned understanding by design, and there's a Dakar Academy in Senegal. It's another school that we're partnering with a lot on this discussion. And I was up there along with David Church, who's also a co-author of Making Thinking Visible. And they're seeing the same connection that you just brought out, is how the principles of understanding by design as a model for teaching and learning, or as a framework, and the pursuit of intellectual virtue are deeply and intimately, naturally, mutually supportive, and they fit together well. And so, as for Christian educators, the idea that these two concepts can really be transformative in the way that we think about teaching and learning, and so these are ideas that are germinating, and people are seeing the same connections that you're seeing. There's a very rich potential for Christian education to be not just a distinctive, but distinctively, you don't want to say superior, but yes, like where we can offer a richness in terms of the type of education, the way we're going about learning, that can be really a light to the field of education. So yeah, it's a really exciting set of connections, and I'm glad you brought those out.
Well, I hate to stop this conversation because it's so rich, but I'm really actually planning on sharing this interview in particular, not just on the Calvary Conversations website and podcast, but to my own education students in my courses at Calvary, because I really just think this is something we need to be talking about a lot more. Ultimately, character is the goal of our walk with God, even of sanctification. It is for renewing of the person, of the mind, of the inner being. And boy, I just think that you really have given some great language to help us understand that. So thank you so much for your work, Phil, on this. And again, I encourage anyone listening to pick up and read the book Virtuous Minds. You'll find it on Amazon, and it's a great read and a great entry point into this. And Phil, again, a compliment to you. It is written in such a way that it is not heady. It is very well organized and very accessible in terms of its understandability. It's not just for the high intellectual, but it's for those of us who want to develop that character in ourselves and in the people that we disciple and impact. So thank you again, Philip, very much. Thank you for listening to Calvary Conversations. This is a service of Calvary University in Kansas City, Missouri. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Calvary Conversations, a service of Calvary University in Kansas City, Missouri. We invite you to participate in the conversation by contacting us through the Calvary University website, calvary.edu, or by calling us at 816-322-0110. Join us again next week for another Calvary Conversation.